This is Linux Sucks 2018. How many times have I done this so far? Is this 8, 9, 10? Something like that? Something like that. I don't remember the first year I did this. I think it was 2007, 2008? Something like that. Anyway, I skipped 1 year because I was lazy that year. But this is the new one. Last year, I didn't do this here. This is at Linux Fest Northwest. I did it at Scale last year, which is this stupid conference that's not Linux Fest Northwest. I told the organizers it was going to be the last one I was ever going to do. Like, I told everybody that. Like, I was like, this is Linux Sucks for the last time. And I go down there, and they put this on a big billing, and they gave me this huge room, and I totally lied. I lied to them. I lied to you guys. I lied to everybody except me and my wife. We're like, I'm just going to prank everybody. No, this is Linux Sucks forever, because it always sucks. However, when I did Linux Sucks for the last time, part of the idea was things have changed a lot, right? The first one of these I ever did, which was in a classroom up there somewhere in this building. It was literally 1 hour of me ranting about things that didn't work and how there's no good video games for Linux. That's what it was, and that's totally different now. Nothing is the same. Our entire worlds are the same. Where am I at? And I wanted to do a presentation that kind of wrapped up that chapter of Linuxiness, right? Because it's not like it was. How many people were around in the Linux world in the late 90s and early aughts? It's different, right? It's not like it was. I mean, we did not have Steam going on in the late 90s. I mean, things are just totally different. So, there are still people that cling to the old adages of various ways that Linux is terrible. And they're all wrong. Like this. Linux is bad for games. This just isn't the case anymore, right? So we're not going to talk about that today because anyone who brings that up as a point for why Linux stinks is dumb. Like, they just don't know. Like, they haven't tried it. The reality is you can get so many commercial titles for Linux nowadays, it's just obscene. So we're not going to talk about that because that'd be pointless. Also, I talk to a lot of people, video producers and all sorts of people who constantly claim that they can't do their job on Linux. I talked to an accountant who, I kid you not, does every bit of his work in web-based applications, who claimed he couldn't do his work on Linux. I spent an hour arguing with this guy, and he still didn't get it. Was he wrong? Yes, of course he's wrong. You can do video editing on Linux, you can do gaming on Linux, you can get all of your work done on Linux. Literally, the only reason you wouldn't be able to get your work done on Linux is if you're making Macintosh or Windows applications. That's the only thing. If you're doing anything else, it works. So we're going to ignore all that stuff. Also, the Linux isn't easy to use things. Now, this does not apply to like Gentoo and whatnot, but most Linux distributions, like, all right, Ubuntu, raise your hand if you're using Ubuntu currently, just so I can get a feel for this. This is better than I thought it would be. Last year, almost everyone raised their hand. The world is trending in a good way. All right, how about this? How about this? Quick poll of hands, and people in the video won't see this, so I can pretend like you did whatever and it won't matter. Do you consider your Linux desktop super hard to use? Raise your hand. You do not. Put your hand down. Put your hand down. I didn't say speak. You're wrong. It's a Linux Mac. Don't do that. But the reality is, there are hard-to-use Linux desktops by design. There are literally groups of people who are like, let's make this hard to use. And it's ridiculous, but also wonderful. But most Linux is actually pretty easy to use nowadays, and yet you go on Twitter and you see people constantly complaining about how hard to use various iterations of Windows are now. So anyone complaining about Linux being hard to use is stupid. Also stupid. And Linux has bad hardware support. This one drives me friggin' bonkers. This was totally true. The first year I did this, I think we spent probably 20 minutes whining and complaining about Wi-Fi drivers, right? I mean, this is what our life was a decade ago. Our life was we wake up in the morning, we update our Linux kernel, and we spend the afternoon getting wireless working again. That's right. I mean, that's what we did. That was living. Nowadays, how many people legitimately just, oh, they can't get their Wi-Fi working on their laptop ever? Anyone?
Not me, but I saw it.
Yeah. So you know a guy who knows a guy who couldn't get Wi-Fi working? Do you have a Canadian girlfriend? That'd be pretty cool. See, it's no. Put your hand down.
HP laptop, it was cancer, but I did get it to work.
Okay, so you had an HP laptop. Again, that doesn't count. They don't work on Windows either. All right. So all those things aside, something I realized is that totally worked. I just made random grunting noises and it got quiet. Oh, dang it, you were done?
Next time, though.
I thought I had power. So there are ways Linux sucks, and it's getting worse. We're at this point, it's almost like a bell curve of Linux not sucking, and we got all the way up to this top of this roller coaster ride, and we're like, we can see forever, it's amazing. And right now we're just ready to dive down into this plummety doom. And there are things that are sucky, but they're very different than they were just a couple years ago. And I realized that they were driving me bonkers, and so we're gonna talk about those things today. This isn't super happy. In years past, I've done this shtick where I get up and be like, Linux sucks because there's a lot of different distributions and stuff. And then I'm like, nah, that's why it's great. And it's all happy and roses. By the end, we're not going to be like Linux is great. We're just going to be depressed. I'm serious here, guys. This is not like before, so buckle up. Again, yeah, that's enough. Everybody, good night. This has been fun.
Oh, that was a dirty move.
Yeah, we're starting out with this one. And yes, I had the most slides in this deck are about Microsoft and the related stuff. And yes, that is ridiculous, and yes, that is going to annoy a few of you. However, there are some very non-technical things happening in our world that are impacting us. And they're driving me crazy, and I think they're making Linux suck, and I would like to go through it. But before we dive too far into that, let's have a quick refresher course of Microsoft and Linux, just so we are all on the same page as we're going forward here. This is a great quote. I like that quote. It's a nice quote. Microsoft CEO, Linux is cancer. Nice, nice. Just going to read this one here. I know it's a wall of text. This is also from the CEO of Microsoft. Linux itself is a clone of an operating system that is 20 plus years old. That is what it is. That is what you can get today. A clone of a 20-year-old system, he says with sweaty armpits. I'm not saying that it doesn't have some place for some customers, but that is not an innovative proposition. Well, that's interesting. Throughout the years, Microsoft has stated that Linux violates many patents. At one point, lawyers from Microsoft stated that companies that use Linux, any company that uses Linux, is in violation of 235 Microsoft-owned patents. That number grew a lot over the last 15 years, especially over the last 7 to 8 years. In fact, Microsoft has sued several companies. The most enjoyably weird one was when they sued the GPS maker TomTom for not paying license fees for those patents because TomTom, those little GPSs that no one uses anymore. Does anyone have a TomTom anymore? He's got a TomTom, that one guy, cool. So those were rad, right? But those ran Linux. And they were in violation of 3 patents. I think one of them was about the fat file system, and there was 2 others as well. And Microsoft sued TomTom because they didn't pay basically a protection scheme for those particular patents. This is a statement from Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation. This is from back when those patent suits were going on. This is an important one to remember coming from Jim Zemlin, executive director of the Linux Foundation, that I'm repeating multiple times. Microsoft's patent license agreements are not news. The company is trolling for dollars, and companies are compelled to settle for less money than it would cost to litigate with Microsoft. Clearly, he wasn't thrilled with this. Does anyone in this room think it was awesome when Microsoft sued companies for using Linux? So no hands up, though. That's definitely. Okay, cool. You guys remember this? Back in 2006, Microsoft entered into a deal with Novell Corporation, then the owners of SUSE, for a patent protection deal. In exchange for Microsoft purchasing $100 million worth of SUSE Enterprise Linux, SUSE and Novell agreed to the patent protection program from Microsoft. This was a big deal. Do you guys remember when this was going on? If you were around back then, it was the controversy of the day. And there was several websites, including one called boycottnovell.com, that were rather pissed off about this, right? It was a big, big deal. And the reality was, Novell and SUSE weren't the only ones that entered into patent protection deals with Microsoft. And so you guys understand, a patent protection deal is basically a way of saying, I am going to pay Microsoft however much undisclosed money, because none of these companies that did this ever disclosed how much it cost. And there's no price list on Microsoft.com if you're curious. Many, many companies did this, simply to say, I will pay Microsoft money in exchange for Microsoft not suing me into oblivion for using Linux. This was in 2006. Additional background. Embrace, extend, extinguish, right? This is the common thing that we yell at Microsoft about, yell at Linux about. This is actually a real thing. This isn't our impression of Microsoft, right? This is an internal strategy. They actually called it this. And I wanted to cover this very, very quickly here so you guys know exactly what we're talking about. And I'm going to read text here, and that is the most boring thing ever to do in a presentation, but it's really important, and I have the pulpit, so I get to. This is a 2007 court case, Combs versus Microsoft. There was a gentleman named Ronald Alapin who gave expert testimony about what this embrace, extend, extinguish is. I'm going to read a little bit. This is a Q&A. This is during the court case. Question. Okay. And now again, for the jury, what does embrace mean in this context as used by Microsoft employees? It's used to indicate a strategy where Microsoft will embrace the standards or the specifications and interfaces of another company's software. Okay, and what does extend refer to? Once the specifications have been embraced, then Microsoft will extend them and add additional interfaces to proprietary to Microsoft. Okay. And when you say add additional proprietary interfaces that are Microsoft's, what impact does that have technologically to other independent software vendors and OEMs? Well, the result is, or the impact is, that what was once sort of community development property, the work of the industry and the industry participants, is appropriated essentially, is taken over by Microsoft. And then Microsoft takes it, and with its proprietary extensions makes it essentially unavailable on a going forward basis to the industry participants who were responsible for first developing the specifications and the standards. Okay! And when Microsoft makes those APIs unavailable to certain ISVs and OEMs, what's the impact to those ISVs and OEMs of their ability to technologically create products? It reduces their ability to create products, especially products that will interoperate with Microsoft's products. So then this happens. Microsoft loves Linux. The new Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, came out and Microsoft loves Linux, Microsoft loves open source. This is clearly a little bit of a change from their past stance, right? Is anyone a little bit skeptical? Okay. over the last 2 years, Microsoft purchased a seat on the Linux Foundation board. So they are actually, Microsoft sits currently on the board of directors for the Linux Foundation. They purchased that. In fact, if you go to Linux Foundation's website, they have a price list that tells you how much it costs to purchase a seat on the Linux Foundation board, in case any of you would like to pony up the $500,000 to do so. Yeah. Right? That's why I'm not in the seat of the Linux Foundation right now. Anyway, they also purchased a keynote back at the Southern California Linux Expo earlier this year. Again, you can just do that. At most big conferences, you can just go up to them and say, I will pay you $30,000, put my logo at the top, and oh, by the way, give me the premium keynote. Which means not only does Microsoft sit as on the board of directors for the Linux Foundation, they are also the premier keynote of the largest American Linux conference. Anyway, kind of worth noting that. And then, of course, they just announced their first Linux-based operating system, Sphere OS, that requires Windows and Visual Studio to program for. Perhaps now is a good time to talk about the embrace, extend, extinguish thing. So they've embraced Linux by paying to have a seat on the board. They've embraced it to have the piece of software out there, their own operating system that's Linux-based, and they've extended it to require proprietary Microsoft-only technology. In fact, you can't even code for Sphere OS, their Linux-based distribution, without Windows. You have to use Windows and Visual Studio to code for Linux, Microsoft's Linux. So they've extended it. They haven't extinguished it yet. Clearly, we're all here, right? Nobody's extinguished yet? And how exactly do you extinguish free and open source software anyway? You can't. Microsoft can't just get a seat on the board and say, okay, close down Linux now, right? We're all still going to use it. And if they did say that, wouldn't we all just go, well, fork it, and we've got our own Linux, right? I mean, that's the truth. They can't extinguish it like they could so many other things. So perhaps extinguish is a bit extreme. I like to call this mild extinguishing. It's more of doing individual acts that slowly erode what it is we try to accomplish here in the Linux, open source, and free software world. To give you an example, does anyone know about the case with VMware and their GPL violations? Has anyone been following that a little bit? All right, so the basics is this. VMware was noticed that they were violating the terms of the GPL. Very simple. A lot of companies do it. Sometimes by accident they get notified and they rectify it. Not really a big deal. VMware is not rectifying it. What does VMware do? Well, they get a seat on the board of directors of the Linux Foundation. In fact, they did like Microsoft. They paid a huge amount of money and became one of the big members of the Linux Foundation. One of the chief organizations that was working on GPL enforcement, and specifically on the VMware case, is the Software Freedom Conservancy. Now, the executive director of the Software Freedom Conservancy, as this was going on, announced, I'm going to run for a seat on the community board for the Linux Foundation, because they had that. They had this community thing where they're going to have a couple of people from the community that can be on the board, because then the community can help drive it, not just big companies. A day and a half, I want to say about 36 hours later, the Linux Foundation announced that they're canceling that. No more community people. We do not want community people in there. So the end result is, because of VMware's contributions to the Linux Foundation, I would say it's a pretty reasonable estimation that we've lost community involvement with the Linux Foundation itself because of that. And Microsoft sits on the board of directors now. There's a point where a paper cut is just annoying. But when you have 1 million paper cuts, that's a real problem. You know what I mean? It's like Minions, you know? It's like those little yellow dudes. One of them's not a big freaking deal and it's kind of adorable, but thousands of them mobbing you will crush you to death. And that's kind of where we're at here right now. Millions and millions of Microsoft paper cuts coming at us. They're accelerating the amount of investment around Linux. And many people, I seriously want to know, do you think it's a good idea that Microsoft is investing engineering and monetary resources into Linux? Hands up. There's a couple of you, right? I mean, don't be shy. There's got to be a few more. Come on. A couple, two more. You can't raise your hand twice. It's fine. But the reality is, this is a real ongoing thing. It's going to have an impact on us. That's established. Whether you like it or dislike it, this is going to have an impact. Do you want Microsoft having an impact on our world? This is ours. This is our place. How many people have been to Linux Fests before? Do you like Linux Fests? Do you like going to them and hanging out with like-minded Linuxy people where there's no Microsofty people? I do. I worked at Microsoft for half a decade. I don't want to go back to that. Reason number 2, and this kind of dovetails into reason number 1, is we've gotten friggin' corporate. How many of you go to other Linux conferences throughout the year? Like some of the other ones? Only a couple of you. Well, it gets kind of intense because the neckbeards are going away. They're becoming extinct. How many neckbeards do you see out here? I mean real neckbeards, not like this guy who has like a well-trimmed thing going on. I mean those crazy things. You guys know what I'm talking about, where there's like a ham sandwich stuck over here, and it's like,
Hey, I combed out the ham sandwich.
you do have the neckbeard. This guy's cool. All right, you make Linux Fest, man. But look around. I mean, I friggin' look like a hipster. So do you. That guy looks like Pee-wee. Like, I mean, sorry, dude. But I mean, realistically, we're all like kind of well dressed, and like, I'm not seeing a ton of stains on our shirts. I mean, and I don't mean this derogatorily towards what Linux and open source conferences used to be, but that's how it was. It was people that didn't give a rat's ass what they looked like. They were there for the code. Now, we have haircuts and Bieber-y things going on. And sorry, I've just been looking at that. I keep thinking, anyway. But what happened? Where did they go? Now, there's 2 possibilities here. One is that there's just more of us now, and so by ratio, there's just less total neckbeards. Or we've driven them out with our perfumes and whatnots. This is concerning to me. Neckbeards are what made us. I'm going to read to you what could be something real. Delivering transformative, engaging technologies that will revolutionize the way we adapt container to cloud workflows in a B2B environments to drive industry engagements and evolution of inner sourcing best practices combined with continuous integration of DevOps to This is awful. This was pulled, now this is a little bit of an extreme. This was 3 separate conference titles from the Southern California Linux Expo smashed together. That's not a joke. Figure out how you can divide that into thirds and make it not awful. I dare you. 3, do it for yourself. Go to the Southern California Linux Expo website, look through them, you'll find these, and it just barf in your mouth. Put your hand down, hands come up later. It's
You didn't go to Scale.
I did not go to Scale this year. It's awful. And it's not that there's one conference that does that. I mean, there's stuff like this happening all over the place. Most of these words mean nothing. Nothing. And some of them did mean something, but now they don't because we hate it so much. And this is what Linux world has become. You look at press releases, you look at announcements, you look at Twitter feeds from companies. Hell, you want to what drives me crazy? Red Hat's Twitter feed. Red Hat has been in this business forever, right? Making Linux, revolutionizing Linux, putting huge amounts of money into desktop Linux, into sound drivers and GNOME and all sorts of things. And yet half of their tweets about how they're going to, we're really taking incentive steps towards effective inner sourcing of, oh my God. Wait, what happened to Red Hat? And it's not just Red Hat. It's all of these companies. It's Canonical, it's SUSE, it's all of them. And it's insane, and it's driving me up the wall because you don't see cool little announcements anymore about how, oh, sweet, just got new encryption working. Oh, it's working now. Everything's compiling. Sweet. You don't see those sorts of announcements anymore. You see this garbage. And then there's the cost of the conferences. We've gotten so friggin' corporate in the Linux world that these are actual costs of some of the largest conferences in our industry. OSCON, which will take place later this summer down in Portland, Oregon, costs $1,200 to go to for a couple of day conference that does not include your airfare, your hotel room, or nothing. It includes a really cheap lunch. I've been there. That's it. But that's $1,200. Now, I go to some of these conferences because I get a press pass or a speaker pass and I'll go. I would never pay that money to go to any of these. How many people have been to these conferences and paid these prices? Anyone?
Well, through a company.
Not through a company, like yourself. Has anybody paid $1,200 to go to a 3-day conference about incentivizing B2B intersourcing? Anybody? This is OSCON, the open source conference from O'Reilly. Open Source Summit from Linux Foundation is $95 cheaper. It's the budget conference. And again, if you look at the next Open Source Summit's taking place, I think in Vancouver later this year. If you look at the lineup of keynotes and of sessions, it's just like that awful blurb I read to you guys. It's that same sort of thing over and over. Look at Red Hat Summit. Oh my Lord, $1,800. The laptop I could buy for $1,800.
Gotta pay those in here somehow.
Yeah. Oh my Lord. This is all again to go to a conference to talk about something that is free. How much did you guys pay to get into Linux Fest Northwest today? Several of you are holding up $0. Now they have a thing where you can become like an individual sponsor and get donate to the conference for like a couple of bucks and get a T-shirt and whatnot. But even that is like 1/100th of the cost of these conferences. So again, everybody who sees Linux Fest Northwest organizers after this, please hug them and high-five them mercilessly, because they're one of the few amazing big conferences out there that are sticking to their guns and making something that's for the community. And most of these, no individuals can go to. Can you go to these?
Oh,
hell no.
Made of money.
Hell no.
Time for that.
Ain't got time for that. It's ridiculous. And the keynotes, I brought this up previously. If you go to these big conferences, there are almost 0 keynotes that are about technology. Almost 0.
Linux Fest doesn't have keynotes.
And Linux Fest doesn't even have keynotes, which is great. But most of them are being purchased, whether it's by Microsoft or Intel. And again, that's not to badmouth the companies purchasing the keynotes. That's just to say that our opportunities to get together and schmooze and grab a burger together and have these conferences where we're all in one place, finally we can be with people like ourselves. It cost us $1,200 to do it, to sit in a room to watch a commercial for a proprietary closed source company at our open source conference. This is what we have become, and this is all of us. This is all of our faults. This is my fault. I worked at some of these companies. This is my fault. It's definitely his fault. And this is really important to think about. The Linux Foundation, they are a big foundation now, and they pay Linus, among other people, Greg KH and other Linux developers, which is good, right? We want to see Linus Torvalds being paid because the man deserves cheddar. That's what I'm talking about. So who pays the Linux Foundation? Well, here's a list of companies that pay the Linux Foundation huge amounts of money. AT&T, Cisco, Microsoft, Oracle, VMware, Facebook, Adobe, American friggin' Express, Capital One, Comcast, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and, I kid you not, the Moscow Exchange. This is a small sampling. And yeah, it's some of the funnier to me sampling, but there are others as well. There are multiple other banks and whatnot, and you can just look this up on the Linux Foundation website. Now, is that to say that these companies, these big, massive, mega firms that peddle in people's debts shouldn't be investing in Linux? No. I think everyone should be able to invest in free software and open source, right? But just the same, they're paying our bills. if the company is paying your bills, that company gets an awful lot of sway over you. Pee-wee, where do you work? Oh, wait, don't tell me. Do you work at a company? Does that company have the ability to influence you to do things? Do you do things for your company? You had to think about that for a second. You do.
More willingly.
But if they came to you and said, do this or we don't pay you anymore, and it's like, but you probably want to pay your mortgage or your rent or your food. You like food?
Yeah.
Freezer burritos are good, right?
Oh,
yeah. I like freezer burritos too. I want to keep buying them. So if people pay me and they come to me and says, hey, you know what? I'm responsible for $500,000 coming into your thing, like a lot of these companies are for the Linux Foundation, $500,000. Do this thing for us. Ignore these GPL violations. Do this thing. If you're the Linux Foundation, what do you do? And this is not a knock on the Linux Foundation, because the reality is, I think most of us, if we're sitting in that position, if we're the director, let's say I make the Lunduke Foundation, and Morgan Stanley says, I'm going to give you $500,000 because I love open source so much. I'm going to go, hell yeah, you are. And then about 6 months later, Morgan Stanley comes up to me and goes, you know that $500,000? We were just looking at next year's budget, and I think we've probably got the budget for that $500,000 again, but man, if you stopped making fun of Microsoft, that would be really good for us. Would my videos suddenly stop making fun of Microsoft? They might. I love $500,000, guys. Right? And I feel like I'm fairly strong-willed about stuff like this. But $500,000's $500,000, and you start multiplying that by a whole bunch of companies who have identical needs and identical wishes for the organization, and you've got a situation where even the most altruistic and wonderful organization and foundation is going to be at least experiencing some significant impact. Now again, Microsoft, who pays $500,000, and sits on the board of directors, which means they can vote about what the Linux Foundation does. They get a vote. They sue companies who use Linux for using Linux. They do this regularly. And they pressure other companies into patent protection deals. And VMware appears to be a GPL violator who seems to have encouraged the Linux Foundation to not allow people onto their board who are pro-GPL. This seems like a problem to me. And this is all because we've become successful. This is all. How many people here are developers? Software developers. All of you did way too damn good of a job. Because these companies want in on this, right? They've gotten to the point, they've done what we asked them to do. They've said, yes, we do like Linux. Thanks for telling us over and over again for years that we should be using free software and open source. Now we're going to invest millions into it and drive you out. See you guys later. That's exactly what's happening right now. And it's our fault. We brought this on ourselves. How many times have we had those conversations with people talking about how we want Linux to be mainstream? We want to get to be like 40, 50% desktop usage market share. How great would that be? And then invariably, like on Reddit or some forum, someone will chime in and be like, actually, I don't want that. That seems like it might be bad. And then everyone else is like, shut up, you. That guy, he was right. We became successful. We run almost every smartphone, set-top boxes, servers across the world, so much money, and with that much money, the big companies want a piece of it. And in order to get a piece of it, they need to get involved in it, they need to embrace it, they need to extend it. They have to do those things. There's no choice in the matter, that's just how their sorts of businesses work. They want that cheddar. And then there's this. This has been driving me a little nuts lately. Because Linux, and I'm not talking about just the kernel, though I'll have some stats for the kernel, but we're talking about the whole Linux desktop free software open source ecosystem has gotten big and bloated. And we just don't get faster like we used to. How many people were using Linux like back in like 92, 93, 94? Yeah, you guys look old. You guys, we were around, yeah. All right, all the scruffy-looking people that need to go to the doctor more, we all clearly were around back then. Sorry, guys. But back then, was it around 92, we got the first version of X Windows for Linux, right? Was late 92, I want to say, something like that. And it was so slow, it was insane. It was like you'd start it, and you'd go get dinner. And you'd come back and like X eyes would just be popping up to look at your cursor moving around the screen. Like it took forever. But over time, not only did the hardware get faster, but we did a lot of optimizations, we threw out a lot of old code, things got faster. And so for many years, every year, Linux got faster. Sometimes we even got leaner. Sometimes we even had less code in our system. Faster, more features, less memory usage. It was amazing. And that doesn't happen anymore. Like, there's a few instances here and there, but for the most part, how many people are using current GNOME desktop? Yeah, it's big and bloated, ain't it? It's cool. I'm using it right now. But is it bigger than GNOME 2? Is it slower than GNOME 2?
Definitely.
In every respect. Yes, it was. How about KDE 4, the Plasma desktop, where when you click a button, it takes 3 seconds to respond? How many people are using that? I like the really nervous guy. He's like, they're going to hit me for using KDE. It's cool. We're all cool. All friends. All friends. But again, slow. KDE 3, the previous version, greased lightning. Super fast. It was getting faster, in fact. Their point releases were smaller. Not every release, but some of the releases were smaller than the previous updates. That stopped. How many people here were using Unity when Ubuntu Unity was still a thing? That thing was so slow, it was insane. You click a button, it just takes years to respond. I mean, they got rid of it, thank God, but you know what I'm saying? Things just got slow. These are the lines of code in the Linux kernel by the last 6 versions. Grew from, oh my God. That's such a big growth, guys. Millions of new lines of code. Millions of new lines of code. Not millions of lines of code total. Millions of new lines of code. What happens when you have more code running? Does anyone know? Does it use more memory, perhaps? Yes. Does it oftentimes use more CPU cycles because there's more to do, because there's millions of new instructions to run? Yes. That's what's happening here. Now, in some cases, there are some performance optimizations that have gone in here for some key platforms and architectures that have made up some of the difference. But the reality is, it's growing really fast. Here's the number of files. That's 55,000. What is this number of files of? The kernel only. Did anyone ever looked at that before? That is the number of files in the Linux. How many Linux kernel developers do we have here? Okay, has anyone tried to build the Linux kernel? Right. It's an interesting experience, right? It's not terribly hard to do once you get the hang of it, but you realize we are over 60,000 files that you gotta pull down from a Git repo now. That is insanity. And look at how fast that's growing. Let's do a projection. Yeah, we're going to be hitting 50 million lines of source code in no time. It is insanity. It is insanity. We are not getting faster, we're getting slower. Which means not only are we getting corporate-y with being controlled by Microsoft, but our software is getting bigger and bloated and slowing down a whole hell of a lot. But this should say number 4. It says number 3. We'll skip that right now. But non-Linuxy Linux drives me friggin' bonkers. Absolutely insane. Like Android. How many people use Android? Everybody pretty much, right? Wait. Who has an iPhone? Wait, keep your hands up. Hands way up, hands way up, hands way up, up. Everyone look around. These are the iPhone users. You guys are all very brave. But Android is Linux, right?
Maybe.
Apt? Zipper? Yum? No, not on there. Because it's not Linuxy, is it? It's not a Linuxy system. It's a Java runtime on top of a Linux kernel, right? So, well, why are we celebrating? Like really? Like why are we celebrating? It would be like if Microsoft was celebrating because the NT kernel got put in a new Macintosh, and they're like, yay, it's like Windows now, but everything else was a Mac. Like, well, no, no one really even needs to know that the Windows NT kernel is in there, guys. No one knows or cares. No one knows other than us or cares that Linux is in there. I mean, we yell about it enough. Android is Linux, and that people kind of know it now, but not really. I mean, does it matter? And when we sit down and use our device, is it like our desktop? Is it like our server? No, it's not. It's not at all. And yet, it's the most dominant operating system on the planet. On the planet. And it's Linux, but it's not. And that's so friggin' sad. It's like that. Now, to be fair, Chrome OS, someone just shouted Gentoo, is based on Gentoo, right? So, which is notoriously the stupidest Linux distribution ever, right? But it's you're welcome. But still, it is Linux. And there is a shell in there and some shell utilities, and it is possible to run Linuxy apps on it, but they just go through significant efforts to make it hard for you, right? And there's some possibility now that Google might be talking about maybe running some Linux applications on it, you know, whatever, 5, 10, whatever years later.
Canning it. There's
Yeah, I don't even know what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's friggin' Google. They'll cancel it soon, I'm sure. But here we are with Chrome OS. Is it Linux? If I give you 2 laptops, you sir, I give you 2 laptops. One, they're identically spec'd. One is running Chrome OS and only Chrome OS with a locked bootloader. And you can't do anything else with it, but you can use Chrome like nobody's business. Or I give you whatever Linux distribution you want and a fully unlocked bootloader, and you can run whatever you want, including Chrome. Which one do you choose? Obviously, right? But that's what it is. And yet we look at these numbers, like the net market share numbers and everything, that say Linux is growing. It's growing so fast. And most of it's because of Android and Chrome OS, and that sucks. And then there's these bastards. Do you have a set-top box? Do you got cable? It's probably running Linux. Can you do anything with it? Nope. No, you can't. It's awful. It's awful. Do you have like Frontier or Verizon or Comcast? It's probably running Linux. Most of their boxes are, not all of them, but most. They're slow, they're buggy. You can't SSH into them to save your life. And well, actually 1 or 2 of them you can, but those were bugs. And anyway, that's a different story. But they lock them the hell down, right? And you don't get to have fun with them. They are not yours. And that's the beautiful thing about a Linux laptop. This little laptop's running Linux. I can do whatever I want to it. I can bork this machine up. I can destroy it. I can be like, you know what? I'm gonna do everything as root, and I'm just gonna see what happens. It's mine. No one can tell me not to do that. All the machines I just mentioned, Android, Chrome OS, all those millions of lockdown devices, which include those billions of IoT devices that so many companies, including Microsoft and Canonical, who have the exact same strategy, that's weird, are making. You can't do anything with. They're not yours. And yet we celebrate when we see Linux shipping on things. We did this. Every problem I've talked about so far is our fault. We did all of this. Oh yeah. Also, Ubuntu drives me crazy. This. We have things we don't even know if we want to have. This is just a general, like, philosophical thing. From a technological, I almost said technologically standpoint, but in my head I fixed it, and now I'm admitting that I almost screwed up. This was fun. Things like this. Anyone use the Linux subsystem for Windows? That's weird. Don't do that. God.
I was only curious.
I was only curious. That's how it starts. Oh my Lord, people. Or systemd. How many people desperately, before systemd was created, seriously, let's be honest with each other. Before systemd was released, how many people were sitting around and thinking, my init script is great, but I wish it did almost everything else my operating system did, so it was huge? Who was thinking that? You were not. I love sarcastic people, but I don't know if you are being right now. You and me, you're a mysterious guy. But who was thinking that? Even now, who doesn't want systemd? Okay, who does? Hands down, who does want systemd? We don't even know if we want this. Snappy, who doesn't want Snappy? Hands down, who wants Snappy?
What's snappy?
Exactly. Mir is a display manager. Not the space station. No. The display server. Does anyone wish Mir was a shipping thing on their desktop? It was being worked on. There was a monkey suit with you, yeah, I know. But again, it was being worked on with tons of money, with tons of engineers, and we didn't even know if we wanted to have it. The people working on it, I know most of them. Some of them really wanted it and they didn't know why, and the rest of them were pretty convinced they didn't want it. And they were building it. Who uses GNOME? Hands up. Okay, hands down. KDE. Hands down. Who still uses Unity? You do not. You do not, you metal-haired hippie. No way. But seriously, we don't know what we want, and we have it. You could say, but that's an amazing thing. We love choice. But the reality is, we don't even know if we want these things to begin with. Okay, let's take everything off to the side. Let's pretend KDE was never invented. Side note, everyone knows what KDE stands for, right? The cool desktop environment. Cool with a K. That's true, and it's weird. Let's pretend that KDE does not exist, right? And someone came up to you and said, hey, there's this API out there. It's called Qt. And it's for profit, and it's mostly proprietary, but we'll sub-license it to you, and we'll make it we'll make it more open sourcey, and we'll give you a good license for it. Make a desktop around it, but make it slow. Who wants it? Now KDE's got a lot going for it, a whole lot going for it. The reality is it's got a ton of great features, but if you were to just pitch it to somebody based on what it actually is, maybe like 3 people would want it. And yet, we built it, have been building it for decades with huge communities of amazing developers. And we don't even know if we want it. How about these? What package manager do you guys use? Oh, let's all shout it out at once, because honestly, it doesn't matter if we understand what you're saying or if it's a mumbled mess, because it's package managers, and nobody cares. Like, apt is fine, zipper is fine, yum's fine, package, whatever, doesn't matter, right? None of it really matters. Who's used more than one package manager on different distros? Did it all work? Yeah, more or less. And almost everybody was like, yeah, well. By the way, that is the right answer. If one of these went away right now and was just simply drop-in replaced by a different one, would you die? Would you even be upset? No, in fact, and this is an absolutely true thing. Zipper, so Zipper's over on the OpenSUSE side, right? Functionally, it's essentially identical to apt, so much so that there's a package on OpenSUSE called fake aptitude that literally lets you run exactly the aptitude commands on OpenSUSE. There's just no difference. It looks and functions exactly the same. That's how completely pointlessly arbitrary these divisions are. And did anyone ask someone, hey, could you make another package manager for me? Did anyone do that? Anybody? Did anyone email someone at a distribution and say, please, for the love of God, a new package manager? You did? Are you raising your hand, or were you scrapping?
I was thinking that it would be cool to use download over IPFS or BitTorrent instead of HTTP, but that's totally different.
Don't start adding stuff, man. People will go crazy. But again, we don't even know if we want those things. So here's where we're at. Here's where we're at really right now. Linux is getting more bloated, more filled with Microsoft, whether you like that or not. More corporate-y, whether you like that or not, and less Linux-y. So that's where we're at. This is not really even my opinion. I mean, you can tell my opinion. Clearly my wording and my body expressions tells you what my opinion is. But these are the things that are happening. And you could come away from this thinking, hell yeah, about time that Linux got less Linux-y and more Microsoft-y and slowed down a little bit. But that's not really my personal feeling. But this is where we're at. We hit that top of that roller coaster. Linux is working pretty good, right? Everyone's enjoying it? Who here doesn't use Linux as their main desktop? Only a couple. Only a couple. It's really okay. You don't have to be fishy about it. Just get it up there. Let your freak flag fly. It's fine. But this is where we're at right now. It does have more Steam games, though. And that seems to be going up. So we've got that going for us. But this is where we're at right now. We have more Steam games, more Microsoft, more code. We're eating up more RAM than before. We are more slow, and we get to applaud ourselves for having the kernel in things that we can't get SSH or sudo access to. Thank you. This is Linux as of 2018. Everyone go enjoy the rest of the conference and try not to get sad. Go. Go. You're good. That's really it. There's no happiness here. This is the best bright spot I can give you guys.